The morning sun had just started to rise over the small town, and the streets were quiet except for the occasional car or bicycle passing. The air carried a hint of freshness and the smell of damp earth from the night before. People were beginning their day going about simple routines. Some were walking to work, while others were preparing breakfast in their homes. The town was small, and everyone knew each other, or at least knew of each other, the kind of place where news traveled fast. And no story stayed hidden for long. The main street had a few shops, a small market, and a church at the center. It was the kind of church that had stood for decades, its walls slightly worn but the doors always open for anyone who wished to enter. A person who would soon step into the church lived alone in a modest house at the edge of town. Their life was simple, yet filled with purpose. They spent their days working small jobs, helping neighbors, and occasionally volunteering for community work. Even though their income was modest, they were content and proud of the life they had built with honesty and effort. They were not someone who asked for help often, but this morning was different. There was something that needed attention, something that could not wait any longer. For several days, they had thought about going to the church. The request seemed small, but important. It was not about money or personal gain, but about helping someone else in need. The person had seen the church as a place of hope where kindness and understanding could be found. They believed that explaining their situation sincerely would lead to a positive response. The thought of walking through the large wooden doors and being welcomed by warm faces gave them courage. As they made their way down the narrow streets, their heart felt heavy with both hope and anxiety. The town was stirring slowly with the sounds of life as shopkeepers opened their shutters and children ran off to school. There was a deep sense of calm in the air, but also an undercurrent of curiosity about what the day would bring. People passing by offered polite greetings. Some stopped briefly to chat, while others kept walking without much notice. The person nodded politely, but their mind was focused on the task ahead. Reaching the church, they paused outside and looked up at the tall structure. The stained glass windows reflected the sunlight, and the bells hung silently above. The doors were old but sturdy and had carvings that spoke of years of faith and devotion. Taking a deep breath, they pushed the door open and stepped inside. The atmosphere was cooler than outside and carried a faint scent of candles and old wood. It felt quiet and peaceful, a place where time seemed to slow down. A few people were inside the church, some sitting on the wooden benches in silent prayer, and others arranging flowers or cleaning. The person approached a familiar figure who often greeted visitors and offered guidance. It was someone they had met before during community events, and whose presence always felt comforting. The greeting was warm and polite, and the person explained that they had a small request. First, the conversation was light with smiles and nods. As the person explained the situation, they spoke clearly and calmly, describing the need and why it was important to act soon. They hoped that their sincerity would be understood and that the church would offer the help they were seeking. Everything seemed normal until the response came. The reaction was not what the person had expected. It was polite on the surface, but there was a coldness in the words, a hesitation, and a distance that was unfamiliar. The simple request had somehow become complicated, and the warmth they had hoped for was replaced with confusion and restraint. The person felt a mix of emotions rising within them. Confusion was the first feeling as they tried to make sense of the unexpected response. They had expected understanding, or at least some guidance. Instead, there was a formality that made the heart sink. They hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to continue speaking or to leave. The weight of the moment pressed heavily, and the quiet of the church seemed suddenly louder. Despite the initial shock, the person tried to explain further, adding details and clarifying their intentions. They spoke slowly and carefully, making sure every word reflected honesty and purpose. Their hope was that patience and clarity would break the tension and lead to the help they sought. But each word seemed to meet with polite nods rather than action. The person realized that something deeper was influencing the response, perhaps rules or unseen barriers that were not immediately apparent. After a while, the conversation ended with a suggestion to come back later or to speak to someone else at another time. The words were courteous but empty in meaning. The person thanked them and left the church, stepping back into the morning light with a heavy heart. Their mind raced with questions and doubts about what had just happened. They walked slowly through the streets, feeling the weight of disappointment and the confusion of being misunderstood. As they reached their home, they sat quietly thinking about the encounter. The house was simple but comfortable, a place that held memories of small joys and efforts. Made with sincerity, they reflected on the journey and on the hope that had led them to the church that morning. The person realized that not every place or person could offer the understanding they sought, and that even in places of faith, there could be distance and hesitation. Even though the response had been shocking and disappointing, the person did not let it diminish their spirit completely. There was a lesson hidden within the experience, a realization that patience and perseverance were necessary even in situations where expectations were high. They understood that kindness could not always be measured by immediate action, and that understanding sometimes required time and dialogue. Later in the day, they spoke with a few neighbors, quietly asking for advice and sharing their feelings. The responses varied. Some offered comfort and encouragement, while others suggested looking elsewhere for help. The person listened carefully, absorbing each perspective, but remained determined to follow through on their intention. They knew that their request was valid and that someone in the community would eventually respond with understanding. As the evening approached, the town grew quieter once again. The sun dipped behind the rooftops, and a soft glow spread across the streets. The person sat by the window, reflecting on the events of the day. Their mind moved from disappointment to contemplation, considering how they would approach the situation next.
Ow!
Could they communicate their sincerity more clearly? How could they find the right person willing to listen and act? The thoughts swirled. But there was also a sense of calm understanding that the day had been a step forward, even if the outcome was not what they hoped for. By nightfall, the town was still and peaceful. The person prepared for rest, thinking about the next steps and the possibility of returning to the church. Another visit might be necessary, or perhaps a different approach would yield results. The journey had only begun, and the person felt a quiet determination to continue despite the initial shock and confusion. There was a sense that every effort mattered, and that kindness and persistence would eventually make a difference in the life of someone in need. They closed their eyes with thoughts lingering on the morning and the encounter. The simple request that had seemed so easy to make had revealed a deeper complexity in human nature, and in the workings of institutions. They realized that understanding and compassion could be hidden behind polite words and formal actions, and that courage was required to face such situations without losing hope. The night passed quietly, with a gentle breeze moving through the open window and the distant sound of a clock marking time. The person dreamed of possibilities and ways to navigate the challenges ahead. The heart was heavy with emotion, but also strengthened by the awareness that their intentions were true and that their efforts mattered. Even in the face of unexpected responses, morning would come again, and with it another chance to approach the church or find someone willing to listen. The simple request had not changed. It was still valid and still important. The person knew that the journey ahead would require patience, understanding, and resilience, but they were ready to take it step by step, with hope guiding the way. The day had begun with expectation and ended with reflection, but the story of the request was far from over, and the person felt ready to continue the path they had chosen. The next morning, the person woke with a mix of anticipation and nervousness. Their mind was filled with thoughts about the previous day and the response that had left them confused and uncertain. They prepared themselves for another visit to the church, knowing that patience and clarity were necessary. The sun rose slowly over the town, casting a warm glow on the streets and rooftops. People were beginning their day once more, some heading to work, others carrying out errands, and the town felt alive with quiet energy. The person stepped out of their home and walked along familiar paths, each step filled with purpose and a determination to face whatever awaited them. As they approached the church, the building looked calm and welcoming in the soft morning light. The bells above were silent and the doors stood open, inviting anyone to enter. The person paused for a moment, taking in the structure and the stillness around it. They felt a sense of resolve, knowing that their presence was important not just for themselves, but for the person they were seeking to help. They reminded themselves that sincerity and honesty were their strongest tools, and that they must convey their intentions clearly. Upon entering the church, they noticed more people inside than before, some sitting quietly in prayer, others tending to flowers in the space around the altar. The scent of old wood and candles filled the air, giving a sense of history and tradition. The person approached a familiar figure who had greeted them the day before and exchanged polite words. They explained again their purpose and asked to speak with someone who could understand and assist with their request. The initial interaction was polite, yet careful. The church members listened, but their expressions were measured and formal. There was a tension that was difficult to describe, as if every word was being weighed against invisible rules and expectations. The person felt a mix of hope and anxiety, wondering if their message would finally be understood. They spoke with calmness and clarity, explaining why the request mattered and how it could impact someone in need. Their words were honest and heartfelt, and their posture reflected both respect and urgency. A moment of silence followed as the church members whispered quietly among themselves. The person waited patiently, feeling every second stretch, longer than it should have been. The stillness in the church seemed heavier than before, and the light streaming through the stained glass windows cast colorful patterns on the wooden floor. Their thoughts wandered to the person they hoped to help, imagining relief and gratitude if their request was granted. They held on to this vision to maintain courage and patience. Finally, a senior member of the church approached and spoke in measured tones. Their words were formal and careful, choosing language that seemed polite but distant. They expressed that the request could not be fulfilled immediately and suggested following certain steps that were complicated and not entirely clear. The person listened closely, taking in every detail. They tried to understand the reasoning and to find a way to navigate the instructions without losing sight of the purpose of their visit. Conversation continued with back-and-forth exchanges where the person asked questions and sought clarification. They were careful not to raise their voice or show frustration, but inside, there was a growing sense of frustration mixed with concern. Each answer seemed to create more questions than it solved, and the person realized that navigating the bureaucracy and traditions of the church required patience and tact. They took a deep breath and reminded themselves that persistence and calm communication were their allies. The discussion went on. Other members of the church began to observe. Some whispered quietly to one another, while others simply watched with curiosity. The person felt a subtle pressure from their presence, but did not let it deter them. They continued to speak with sincerity and clarity, explaining the situation again in different ways, hoping that repetition and honesty might help break through the formal barrier. The atmosphere remained tense, but the person felt that small progress was being made as certain. Members nodded or asked thoughtful questions. After some time, it became clear that immediate action was not possible. The person felt a wave of disappointment but did not give up. They politely asked if there could be any exceptions or alternatives, and listened carefully as suggestions were made. Even if those suggestions seemed difficult to follow, the church members offered guidance and instructions that would require additional effort and persistence, and the person noted each point with care, planning how to approach the next steps. Once the conversation concluded, the person thanked everyone for their time and guidance. Despite the formal and cautious response, there was a sense of accomplishment in having communicated clearly and respectfully. They stepped out of the church into the fresh morning air, feeling both relief and lingering uncertainty. Their mind replayed the interaction, analyzing every word and gesture. Searching for understanding and insight, walking through the streets of the town, the person reflected on the experience, thinking about the intentions of the church members and the reasons behind their cautious responses. They realized that even in places meant for understanding and support, there were structures and rules that could delay or complicate good intentions. The person thought about how to navigate these structures without compromising honesty or kindness, and felt a quiet determination to continue despite challenges. They paused at a small park, watching children play and neighbors greeting each other. Some people smiled and waved, recognizing them from previous visits to the church or community events. The person felt connected to the town and reminded themselves that perseverance and patience were valued traits, and that even small efforts could eventually lead to meaningful results. They considered how to plan their next steps, carefully balancing respect for the church with the urgency of their request. Turning home, they sat quietly, considering everything they had learned. They reflected on how communication could sometimes be misunderstood or slowed by formalities, and how clarity and persistence were essential in achieving results. They made notes on how to approach the church differently next time and thought about seeking advice from those who had experience in handling similar situations. Their reflections were deep and thoughtful, focusing not just on the request itself, but on understanding human behavior and institutional responses. As the day progressed, the person carried out small tasks around the home and helped a neighbor with a simple chore. Their mind often returned to the church, and the conversation from that morning, they thought about what words had been most effective, and which ones had caused confusion or hesitation. They considered how to present their requests with even greater clarity and sincerity, ensuring that their intentions were unmistakable and understood by all later. In the afternoon, they decided to talk with a few trusted members of the community, seeking guidance and perspective. They described the events carefully and asked for advice on how to approach the church in a way that respected its traditions while still advocating for the person in need. Their neighbors offered varied advice, some practical, others more philosophical, but all stressed the importance of patience and maintaining sincerity. The person listened carefully and took each suggestion to heart, integrating them into their plan. Evening approached, and the town grew quiet again. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink as the sun set behind the rooftops. The person sat by the window reflecting on the day and the lessons learned about human nature, patience, and the complexities of institutional response. They realized that the journey was not simply about making a request, but about understanding people and navigating systems with respect and determination. That night they prepared for rest, thinking about the next day and the continued effort required. The experience at the church had been challenging but enlightening. It revealed not just the obstacles in the way, but also the importance of perseverance and careful communication. The person felt a quiet sense of resolve, knowing that their journey was meaningful and that their sincere efforts could eventually make a difference. They drifted into sleep, carrying thoughts of hope and preparation for the coming days. Their heart was full of intention, and their mind focused on planning how to approach the church again, perhaps with a slightly different strategy, but always with the same honesty and purpose. They understood that patience was essential, that true understanding often required time and careful dialogue through the night. The town remained still, except for distant sounds of life carrying softly through the streets. The person dreamed of clarity and eventual understanding, imagining a day when their requests would be met with compassion and action. They felt ready to face the challenges ahead, knowing that persistence, patience, and sincerity were the path forward. The story of their simple request was still unfolding, and the person was determined to continue their journey with hope guiding each step. The following day, the person felt a mixture of determination and uncertainty. They had spent the night thinking deeply about the previous encounters at the church and how best to proceed. Their mind was filled with questions about human behavior, rules, and the proper way to communicate effectively. They understood that patience and clarity were essential, but still wondered why their simple requests seemed so complicated. The morning air was cool and refreshing as they stepped outside. The town was beginning to wake with familiar sounds of doors opening, people chatting, and children running off to school. The streets were quiet enough to think clearly, yet alive enough to feel part of a larger world, walking toward the church. The person considered the lessons of the previous visits. They remembered the polite yet distant responses and how carefully they had needed to phrase their words. They rehearsed how to explain their requests more clearly and how to remain calm, even if met with hesitation or indifference. They reminded themselves that the intention behind the request was pure and that maintaining sincerity was the most important factor. Their steps were steady and measured, each one reflecting resolve and focus. Upon arriving the church, they noticed subtle changes. From the previous visits, more people were moving quietly within, some arranging flowers, while others cleaned the pews or prepared for upcoming services. The person felt a sense of nervous anticipation and a hope that perhaps this time there might Be more understanding. They walked through the familiar doors, taking in the scent of old wood and candles and the cool atmosphere that had always made the place feel sacred. They approached the figure they had met before exchanging greetings that were polite and familiar. This time, they were ready to speak with a different member of the church, who, with authority to make decisions, the conversation began carefully with. The person explaining their request in clear and precise language. They spoke slowly, emphasizing the importance of the matter and the impact it could have on someone in need. They chose each word with care, knowing that understanding could hinge on small details. The church member listened attentively, their face neutral, but their eyes reflecting thoughtfulness. The person felt a sense of cautious optimism, hoping that the message was finally reaching its destination. They described the situation, step by step, highlighting why the request mattered and how it could be addressed without causing disruption or conflict. There was an effort to show respect for the church's rules and traditions while maintaining the urgency and sincerity of the As the conversation continued, the person noticed small gestures from the church member, a nod, a pause, a brief smile that hinted at understanding. The person seized the moment to reinforce their intentions and clarify any possible misunderstandings. They avoided impatience and maintained a calm tone, even as their heart raced with hope and anxiety. Each word was deliberate, each sentence crafted to convey honesty and purpose. Outside the immediate conversation, other church members observed quietly, some whispering softly to one another. The person felt the presence of the community weighing on the situation, but did not let it deter them. They continued to speak with clarity, addressing questions and explaining details patiently. They realized that persistence was necessary, and that even a polite refusal or hesitation did not mean the effort was wasted after. Sometime the church member provided guidance outlining specific steps that could be taken. It was clear that immediate action was still limited by rules and procedures, but the person listened carefully, absorbing each instruction. They asked questions for clarification, ensuring that no detail was missed, and that they could follow through effectively. Their mind mapped out the actions needed and considered how to implement them with patience and integrity. The conversation began to shift subtly as the church member asked about the motivations behind the request, and the person explained with honesty the reason for seeking assistance. They emphasized the broader impact of the request and how it related to community well-being. Their sincerity seemed to resonate, and the tone of the conversation became slightly warmer, though still formal. The person noticed that understanding was beginning to grow, even if the rules remained. Leaving the church, the person felt a mix of relief and reflection. The immediate response was not what they had originally hoped for, but there was progress. They had communicated clearly and had been listened to with attention and thoughtfulness. They walked through the town, slowly absorbing the morning light and the sounds of daily life, thinking about how small acts of persistence and clarity could eventually lead to meaningful results. They paused at a small bench in the park, watching people interact and children playing. The scene reminded them that life was full of lessons about patience, understanding, and human complexity. They considered how each interaction at the church reflected broader truths. It's about human nature, about the balance between rules and compassion, and about the importance of communication. Their mind worked to understand not just the situation, but the larger context of the town and its people. Returning home, they took time to write notes, summarizing the conversation, the instructions, and the next steps. They thought about possible challenges and how to overcome them. They considered reaching out to supportive community members for advice while remaining respectful of the church's processes. The reflection helped them feel more organized and prepared for the journey ahead, knowing that every careful effort mattered. Holman offered help to neighbors when needed. Each interaction reminded them of the importance of kindness, patience, and sincere effort. They reflected on how their actions and words impacted others, and how maintaining integrity even in the face of hesitation or misunderstanding was crucial for achieving meaningful results. Their mind remained occupied with plans for the next visit, and ways to ensure the request could be properly understood and acted upon. As evening approached, the sky filled with soft hues of pink and orange, and the town grew quiet once more. The person sat by the window reflecting on the day and the lessons learned. They realized that patience was not passive but active thinking and planning combined with persistence. In integrity, they understood that challenges at the church were not personal rejections, but part of a larger system that required careful navigation and sincere effort. Night fell over the town with a calm stillness, only broken by distant sounds of life moving softly through the streets. The person prepared for rest, thinking about the steps to take next day and how to continue advocating respectfully and patiently. They considered what had worked well in communication, what needed improvement, and how to approach each conversation with clarity, sincerity, and understanding. They felt a sense of quiet determination, knowing that persistence and patience were guiding their actions, and that meaningful results required time and effort. In the quiet of the night, they thought about the people they hoped to help and how important it was to remain focused on the purpose rather than being discouraged by obstacles. They imagined a future moment when their request might be fully understood and acted upon, and allowed that vision to inspire and sustain them. They felt strengthened by the knowledge that persistence, honesty, and careful communication could make a difference, and that even formal or hesitant responses were not failures, but steps toward understanding. They drifted into sleep, reflecting on human behavior, on the challenges of institutions, and on the power of sincere effort and persistence. Their mind held both hope and determination, knowing that the journey would continue, and that each day offered an opportunity to approach the church with respect, clarity, and renewed purpose. They understood that even in places meant for kindness and understanding, there were complexities that required patience and thoughtful navigation. The story of the request continued to unfold, and the person felt ready to continue the journey with courage and integrity. The following morning, the person woke with a deep sense of determination. They had spent hours the night before thinking about the responses at the church and how to approach the situation differently this time. They wanted to be fully prepared and to understand the perspectives of the church members more clearly. The morning air was cool, and the streets were quiet except for the occasional sound of life beginning to stir. The sun rose gently over the rooftops and trees, casting soft light across the town. The person stepped out of their home, feeling a mixture of hope and resolves. They walked toward the church. They reflected on the lessons from the previous visits. They had realized that patience and persistence were essential, and that careful communication could open doors that initially seemed closed. They reminded themselves that their request was valid and important, and that maintaining respect and sincerity was the best way to ensure understanding. Each step toward the church felt deliberate and purposeful. Upon reaching the church, the person noticed familiar sights and sounds. The doors stood open, and a few members were already inside, preparing the space for daily activities. Some were arranging flowers, while others tended to the pews and the altar. The person took a deep breath and entered the building, noticing the calm and sacred atmosphere that had always made the place feel special. They approached the figure they had met before, exchanging polite greetings and explaining their purpose. Clearly and concisely this time, they were directed to speak with a senior member who had authority to consider exceptions and special cases. The person explained their request again with clarity, emphasizing the reasons behind it and the impact it could have on someone in need. They spoke calmly and deliberately, making sure every detail was understood. They were careful to respect the rules of the church, while still highlighting the urgency and importance of the matter. The senior member listened attentively and asked questions, seeking to understand the full context. The person answered with honesty and detail, explaining the situation step by step. They noticed small gestures that indicated growing understanding, a nod, a brief smile, moments of eye contact that suggested the words were reaching their meaning. The person remained calm, even as their heart raced with hope and anticipation. The conversation continued for a long while, with the person clarifying points and the senior member considering options within the framework of the church's rules. They discussed procedures and possibilities, weighing the request against established guidelines. The person realized that the process was complex, but necessary, and that careful attention to detail could make a difference in how the request was received and acted upon. Other members of the church observed quietly, some whispering softly to one another, while others simply watched with curiosity. The presence of the community added weight to the situation, but the person did not let it distract them. They focused on communicating sincerely and respectfully, addressing questions as they arose, and providing explanations when needed. Their patience and careful articulation began to create a sense of trust and understanding. After some time, the senior member outlined steps that could be taken to address the request. It became clear that immediate action was still limited, but there was a pathway forward that required cooperation and diligence. The person listened closely, noting each instruction, and asking for clarification when necessary. They mentally mapped out how to follow through on each step carefully and respectfully, ensuring that nothing would be misunderstood or overlooked. The person also took time to explain their motivations and the broader impact of the request. They emphasized that the intention was not personal gain, but to provide help and support to someone in need. Their sincerity seemed to resonate as the senior member responded with more attentive gestures and a slightly warmer tone. The person realized that understanding was growing, even if the final decision was still pending. Once the conversation concluded, the person expressed gratitude and promised to follow through on the instructions given. They left the church feeling a mix of relief, reflection, and renewed determination. Walking through the streets of the town, they considered the complexity of human behavior, the balance between rules and compassion, and the importance of clear and persistent communication. They thought about the ways in which patience and integrity could eventually lead to meaningful results, even in situations that initially seemed rigid. They paused at a small park, observing children playing and neighbors interacting. The scene reminded them of the value of perseverance and the importance of kindness in all interactions. They reflected on how every conversation and action contributed to understanding and trust, and how maintaining honesty and patience was essential. In navigating complex situations, their mind considered practical steps and strategies for following through on the instructions received from the returning home. They sat quietly reflecting on the progress made and the lessons learned. They considered the importance of empathy and understanding when dealing with institutions and individuals, and how communication could bridge gaps between intention and perception. They wrote notes summarizing the instructions and planned the next steps carefully, thinking through potential challenges and solutions throughout the afternoon. They carried out simple tasks around the home and helped neighbors when possible. Each small action reinforced the values of patience, empathy, and responsibility. They thought about how every effort, whether large or small, contributed to the eventual goal, and how persistence combined with careful planning could lead to success. Even in difficult circumstances, their mind remained focused on the journey ahead and the steps required to follow through on the request. As evening approached, the sky filled with soft colors and the town grew quiet. The person sat by the window reflecting on the day and the lessons learned. They understood that patience was an active effort that required planning, thoughtfulness, and persistence. They considered how to approach the church again if necessary, and how to continue advocating respectfully while maintaining sincerity and integrity. Night fell, and the town became still. The person prepared for rest, thinking about the next day and the continued effort required to follow through on the instructions. They felt a quiet determination, knowing that persistence, honesty, and careful communication were essential for meaningful results. They considered the progress made and allowed themselves a sense of accomplishment while remaining focused on the work still ahead. As they drifted into sleep, they reflected on the importance of understanding human behavior, institutional rules, and the power of sincerity and persistence. They imagined a future moment when their request would be fully understood and acted upon, and allowed that vision to inspire and sustain them. They felt strengthened by the knowledge that careful effort and patience could eventually lead to success, and that even formal or hesitant responses were steps toward understanding. Through the night, the town remained quiet except for distant sounds of life. The person dreamed of clarity and eventual understanding, imagining the moment when their request would be met with compassion and action. They felt ready to face the challenges ahead, knowing that every day offered an opportunity to approach the church with respect, clarity, and renewed purpose. They understood that meaningful results required time and effort, and that their journey was far from over, but guided by hope and integrity. Each step brought them closer to the outcome they sought. The story of the request continued to unfold with lessons about patience, understanding, empathy, and persistence. The person felt ready to continue the journey with courage and careful planning, knowing that sincerity and respect were their most powerful tools, and that the path forward required both thoughtfulness and unwavering determination. The next morning, the person woke with a sense of quiet resolve. They had spent time reflecting on the previous days and the steps needed to move forward. The morning air was cool and filled with the sounds of the town beginning its day. People walked along the streets carrying out routines, and greetings were exchanged in passing. The person felt a connection to the life of the town and to the idea that persistence and sincerity could create meaningful change. Each step toward the church felt purposeful and thoughtful. They approached the building. They reflected on the journey so far. The encounters had been challenging yet enlightening. Each visit had taught them something about patience, communication, and the complexity of human behavior. They understood that rules, traditions could sometimes slow down action, but also recognize the importance of persistence and clarity in overcoming obstacles. Their mind was focused on presenting their requests with honesty and understanding while respecting the processes in place. Upon entering the church, they noticed familiar faces engaged in daily tasks. Some were arranging flowers, while others cleaned and prepared. For services, the person walked carefully and respectfully toward the senior member, who had provided guidance. Before they exchanged greetings politely and began to speak with clarity and sincerity, explaining again the situation and the reasons behind the request. Their tone was calm, deliberate, and focused on the impact that action could have on someone in need. The senior member listened, attentively asking questions and clarifying points to fully understand the context. The person provided answers with honesty and careful explanation. Each word was chosen thoughtfully to ensure the message was received as intended. They emphasized that the request was about helping others and not personal gain, and that the goal was to create positive change for someone in need. Their careful articulation seemed to resonate, and the atmosphere began to feel warmer and more understanding. Church members observed quietly, some whispering softly to one another, while others watched with curiosity. The presence of the community added a sense of accountability, but did not distract the person from their focus. They continued to explain details, patiently clarifying any misunderstandings and reinforcing their intentions. The persistence and sincerity of their communication began to create trust and a clearer understanding of the importance of the request. After some time, the senior member outlined a clear path forward. This time the instructions were precise and actionable. It was understood that immediate action would be limited by procedure, but there was now a definite way to address the request. The person listened attentively, noting each step and asking for clarification where needed. Their mind organized the sequence of actions required to follow through effectively and respectfully. Conversation shifted toward understanding motivations and the broader impact of the request. The person explained with care the significance of the situation and how fulfilling the request could benefit not only the individual involved, but also the wider community. Their sincerity seemed to reach the hearts of the church members, and the tone of the conversation became more supportive and collaborative. They felt a sense of progress that had been missing in previous encounters. Upon concluding the conversation, the person expressed gratitude for the guidance and promised to follow through diligently on the instructions given. They stepped outside the church feeling a mixture of relief, hope, and determination. Walking through the quiet streets of the town, they reflected on the complexity of human interaction and the importance of patience and persistence. They understood that every step in communication mattered, and that thoughtful effort could eventually lead to meaningful results. Sitting for a moment on a park bench, they observed the life around them. Children played with carefree energy, and neighbors greeted each other warmly. The person felt a renewed sense of connection to the community and a deeper understanding of how patience, kindness, and clarity in action could influence outcomes. They considered the way small, consistent efforts could accumulate into meaningful impact and how integrity and communication built trust and understanding. Returning home, they took time to write notes summarizing the instructions from the church and planned the sequence of actions to follow through carefully. They reflected on potential challenges and considered how to address them while remaining respectful and sincere. Their focus was on ensuring that each step aligned with their values and the goals of helping someone in need. Their mind was organized and clear, preparing for the next phase of the journey. Throughout the day, they carried out small tasks at home and assisted neighbors when possible. Each interaction reminded them of the importance of patience, empathy, and consistent effort. They understood that meaningful results were rarely instant and that perseverance combined with thoughtful planning could lead to success even when faced with institutional obstacles. Their reflections reinforced the importance of maintaining honesty and persistence in all actions. As evening approached, the sky filled with soft colors, and the town grew quiet once more. The person sat by the window reflecting on the lessons learned. The journey had been long and filled with moments of confusion, doubt, and hope, yet through each step, they had grown in understanding of human behavior, communication, and the value of sincere effort. They considered how persistence and clarity could transform challenges into opportunities for meaningful impact. Night fell over the town, and the person prepared for rest, thinking about the journey and the continued efforts required. The sense of accomplishment was present not because the request had been fulfilled entirely, but because progress had been made and understanding had grown. They reflected on the patience and perseverance required to navigate complex situations and how every careful step contributed to eventual results. They felt a quiet determination and readiness for the next steps, with a renewed sense of purpose and hope. As they drifted into sleep, their mind held images of clarity, understanding, and eventual resolution. They imagined the day when the request would be met with compassion and action, and allowed that vision to inspire and strengthen them. They understood that persistence, patience, and sincerity were the foundation of meaningful change, and that even challenges or hesitation were part of the journey toward understanding. Throughout the night, the town remained still, except for distant sounds of life. The person dreamed of a future moment when their efforts would lead to the outcome they sought, and when the request would finally be understood and addressed. They felt strengthened by the knowledge that careful planning, thoughtful communication, and unwavering integrity could create positive change even in complex circumstances. Morning would come again, bringing another day of action and reflection. The person felt ready to face the challenges ahead, knowing that each effort mattered, and that persistence and clarity would guide the journey. They understood that meaningful results required time, effort, and thoughtful navigation of both human behavior and institutional rules. Their journey continued with hope, determination, and the quiet confidence that sincere action would eventually bring understanding and positive results. The story of the request reached its conclusion not with a sudden resolution, but with a sense of achieved understanding and progress. The person felt the satisfaction of knowing that persistence, clarity, and sincere effort had created an environment of cooperation and trust. They reflected on the lessons learned about patience, empathy, and the complexity of communication, and understood that these lessons would guide them in all future endeavors. Their journey had been transformative, teaching the value of resilience, integrity, and thoughtful action in the pursuit of meaningful outcomes. Following morning, the person woke with a sense of calm determination they had spent the previous night. Reflecting on the progress made and the steps ahead, the town was quiet, with the first signs of life appearing as people walked along the streets and shops began to open. The air was fresh, carrying the sounds and scents of early morning. The person prepared to continue their journey to the church, knowing that each step forward required patience, focus, and careful communication. Walking through the streets, the person thought about everything they had learned about human behavior and institutional processes. They remembered how previous visits had been challenging yet informative. Each interaction had provided insight into the way rules and traditions shaped responses, and how sincerity and persistence could gradually build understanding. They considered how small, consistent efforts could accumulate into meaningful results, and how empathy and clarity in communication could transform hesitation into cooperation. Upon reaching the church, they paused briefly to take in the familiar structure. The doors stood open and the soft light reflected through the stained glass windows. The person stepped inside, noticing members tending to the space. Some arranged flowers, while others prepared for daily services. The atmosphere was calm, yet purposeful, and the person felt a renewed sense of focus. They approached the senior member, who had previously guided them, exchanging greetings and expressing appreciation for the continued support. The conversation began with a careful summary of the progress made so far. The person explained how previous instructions had been followed and the small results that had emerged from patience and persistence. They spoke calmly and clearly, highlighting the impact that even minor actions had on the situation. They emphasized that their request was driven by the desire to help someone in need, and that the intent was always to act respectfully and thoughtfully within the church's guidelines. The senior member listened with attentiveness, asking questions to clarify details and understand the motivations behind each action. The person answered with honesty, providing detailed explanations and reflecting on the lessons learned from previous interactions. They noted the importance of clear communication and the need to convey intentions without causing misunderstanding. The dialogue was slow but productive, and the person felt a growing sense of connection and trust forming with the church. Members of the church observed quietly, offering occasional gestures of acknowledgement. The person remained focused on explaining the situation and the importance of following through on each step. Carefully, they spoke with sincerity and clarity, addressing questions patiently and ensuring that no detail was overlooked. Their determination and thoughtful articulation gradually created an environment where understanding could grow and cooperation seemed possible. After some time, the senior member outlined additional steps that could be taken within the church's framework. There were still limitations imposed by procedure, but the path forward was becoming more defined. The person listened attentively, noting each instruction and asking for clarification to ensure accuracy. They mentally organized the sequence of actions required to follow through effectively and respectfully. Their mind was focused on aligning each step with the values of integrity and compassion. The conversation also explored the broader impact of the request. The person explained how successful action could benefit the individual involved and create a positive example for the wider community. They spoke about the importance of empathy and understanding and how these qualities could inspire others to act with kindness and thoughtfulness. Their sincerity seemed to resonate with the senior member, and the atmosphere of the conversation became more collaborative and supportive. Once the discussion concluded, the person expressed gratitude for the guidance and reassured the senior member that they would follow through on the instructions diligently. They left the church feeling a mixture of relief, hope, and renewed determination. Walking through the quiet streets, they reflected on the journey so far and the lessons learned about patience, persistence, and thoughtful communication. They understood that even in the face of formal rules and hesitation, meaningful progress could be achieved through consistent effort and integrity. Sitting briefly on a bench in the park, the person observed the life around them. Children played with energy and joy, while neighbors greeted each other warmly. The person felt a connection to the community and a deep understanding of how small, consistent efforts could accumulate into meaningful outcomes. They considered how the values of patience, clarity, and persistence applied not only to the situation at the church, but also to interactions in everyday life. Their thoughts were filled with practical strategies for following through and maintaining sincerity and respect. Returning home, they took time to organize notes on the instructions received and the steps required. They reflected on potential challenges and considered how to address them. While remaining patient and respectful, their mind was clear and focused on the next actions necessary to ensure the request was properly understood and executed. They considered consulting trusted members of the community for guidance while maintaining the integrity of the process and respecting the church's structure throughout. The day the person carried out household tasks and helped neighbors when possible. Each interaction reinforced the values of empathy, patience, and responsibility. They understood that meaningful results were rarely instant and that careful, consistent effort could overcome initial hesitation or misunderstanding. Their reflections reinforced the importance of sincerity and persistence in all endeavors, and the understanding that thoughtful action built trust and cooperation.